Today on the Resilient Schools podcast, I'm talking with Stephen Smith, who's the founder of NoCD, and we're going to talk about OCD. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I learned about this over the last couple of years and saw some similarities to trauma, which I thought were really fascinating, but they were not the whole story. And so I thought it would be beneficial for you to learn about OCD, how it's different from trauma, how some things are similar, and get an idea about how you can help in your school if someone is struggling with trauma. And, not with trauma, how you can help if someone in your school is struggling with OCD. It can be very debilitating, it can be very challenging, but there is a way to fix it. There's a way to treat it, and it requires specialized treatment, and the regular kind of therapy that you might do doesn't actually help. It can actually harm. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Stephen, and if you have questions or comments, please reach out to me or reach out to nocd.com or treatmyocd.com, and they can certainly help you. But this is definitely something that I think more people should know about. It's probably going to affect a number of kids in your school at any given moment, whether they have it or their parents have it or a sibling has it. And so it's worthwhile. I've also learned through learning about this that it can start when kids are babies, and it can go throughout their life. And so in the show notes today, I put a clip from Howie Mandel talking about living with OCD on 2020, and that's a link to a YouTube video about that. So definitely worthwhile to check that out and see what it is, especially after listening to this. And thanks so much for listening to Resilient Schools, and I hope that this is helpful, and would love to hear your thoughts and comments, and please reach out if you think that it is. Thanks so much. Here's my interview with Stephen Smith. Welcome to the Resilient Schools podcast. Today, I'm excited to have on the show Stephen Smith, who is the founder of treatmyocd.com, or NoCD is what the app is called if you get interested and want to check it out. In college, Stephen was a award-winning quarterback, and everything was going well for him. And then he started having intrusive thoughts come in and started experiencing OCD. And within 6 months, he was homebound and wasn't able to do all the things that he loved to do before. It took a lot of time and money for him to get treatment. And so when he finally did, then he said, I've got to make this better for other people. So he created Treat My OCD and wanted to help other people figure out how to manage their OCD. So, Stephen, welcome to Resilient Schools. Anything else you want to add to your bio that was admittedly weak, but
No, it
gave
was
us some insight?
fantastic. It was fantastic. I'm humbled by the introduction, Joshua. Thank you for having me on the podcast today. And we're so glad to be here to help raise awareness for OCD and also to help people get to evidence-based treatment, especially kids.
Yeah, well, that's great. And one of the things that I did not understand about OCD before was I thought it was just that people were quirky and needed to have things organized, but it is so much more than that. Can you give us an idea of what OCD really is?
Sure, sure. So OCD, and this is a epiphany that I had probably 3 months ago. OCD is one of the only words in society which everyone recognizes and almost everyone seemingly misunderstands, right? So it's very rare you have a term which is known by so many people and also is misunderstood at the same time by so many people. The fact that it's a condition, it's a chronic condition, a really severe condition, and it's super misunderstood. Like that's to me is even more rare. And so I say this phenomenon that's been going on in society has gone on for decades, and it's led to most people's OCD not getting the right treatment. And so I'll tell you what OCD is actually like. It's a condition where people have these recurring intrusive thoughts. They could be thoughts, it could be also images, urges, and they usually violate the person's core values and character. So people don't want to have the thoughts or the fears, but because they cause tremendous amounts of distress, and they're polar opposite from who they really are. And so to make the fears go away, people do these very specific actions. The actions are called compulsions. And in the short term, the actions alleviate distress, but in the long term, they actually cause the distress to occur in a much more severe way. And they also create um, the cycles for the fears that ultimately make the person have their intrusive thoughts almost throughout the day at every point. And so we've as a society, in my opinion, have misunderstood OCD to be just like the compulsive behavior, right? People flicking the lights on and off, or you know asking specific questions, right? People don't actually understand that the fear is driven by these obsessions or the intrusive thoughts, images, and urges. And the content of those intrusive thoughts, images, and urges could be violent, could be sexual, religious, relationship based, existential, and they're crippling. It's absolutely crippling. And I can tell you that from firsthand experience. And so, you know, if we could simply raise awareness for, what OC is actually like, what will happen is people will be able to get identified much earlier on in their journey, because we'll ask the right questions. We'll understand if someone's in distress or doing something that appears to be off. We can ask really why, and we can ask that in a really comforting way.
And I think that that's really important. One of the things that we try to do with this podcast is give people tools and strategies for making their schools better for the kids that are actually there. And a lot of our work has focused on trauma. And when I first saw the behaviors associated with OCD, I thought that they were trauma based and that they were from somebody having trauma. However, I knew the kid who was experiencing that and knew that there wasn't any major trauma in the child's life. And so I started questioning what else could it be? And that led me down thinking that maybe there was some autism spectrum disorder or maybe some ADHD, because these things looked like what one of those other things could be. And I was trying to figure it out. And when I finally understood what OCD was, I started asking better questions. Can you help us understand what some of those questions are that we could ask to see what's causing those behaviors, so that we could understand that it's not trauma-based?
Sure. So, I'm not a clinician by training. I'm a person who has OCD, so I can explain to you what folks on our clinical team have said to me, and I can also kind of explain from firsthand experience the questions I would ask just as a person. But I'm not a clinician by training, so I want to highlight that first. The questions, though, that one should ask someone with OCD really are about what is causing you to do those specific actions, if the actions are visible, or really at the end of the day, do you have unwanted thoughts that feel kind of sticky in your head, and do the thoughts you know feel real despite they're somewhat illogical? Because what happens with OCD is people, and again, for a child the questions differ. That's how you probably ask the question to an adult, but I'd say that the challenge is people don't realize that the sticky thoughts oftentimes are the first symptom they experience, right? Thoughts that they typically would be able to let transition from their head, they can't. And unfortunately, those thoughts are oftentimes not just standard strange thoughts. They're thoughts that personally attack the person's, core values or character. For example, a child who has OCD may fear, what if my family member gets harmed? Right? And they may do specific actions just to prevent something bad from happening to their family member, right? And so the question is, well, why are you doing that action, or why do you keep asking me, if I'm okay? And it's simply to basically put out the fear that something bad's going to happen, right? And that fear plays over and over and over again in the child's head. So it's just really trying to ask the question to understand what's driving the behavior, because that can be the biggest way to, or the fastest way to identify if it's OCD or not. And the way you can actually, I should say OCD symptoms or not, the best way to actually identify if someone's suffering with OCD is to do a comprehensive diagnostic assessment. So a licensed therapist can provide that. They can take them through different types of evidence-based scales to determine if their symptoms meet the clinical diagnostic criteria for the condition. And that's what I would recommend if people feel that there might be some OCD behaviors behind their child's condition.
Yeah, I appreciate that you mentioned that you're not a clinician. And one of the things that I'm very adamant about is that teachers do not feel that they need to be clinicians either. And this is really important because so much of the training for teachers asks them to put more on their plate. And what we want to do here is give teachers ideas, skills, and strategies that they can do to start referring kids to the right places. So if you and the reason why I harp on this so much is that if you refer someone to a clinician and don't give the background of what's going on and just say this kid's struggling, they could go down a path that is actually going to be more difficult for that student, especially if they have OCD, as I personally learned. And that's a very challenging thing because you can actually make it worse by allowing the symptoms to or not the symptoms, by allowing the compulsions to continue when the way to treat it is actually to expose them to the things that they're afraid of and help them see that their brain is lying to them. And
Right.
so that I think is a really important basis. And we'll get into the treatment part here in a second, but I want to talk a little bit more about why it's important for us to talk about this because OCD does affect a lot of people. Can you talk about the rate of prevalence that exists with OCD and why it's so important for us to pay attention?
Sure. And so, in the great point you bring up here, Jethro, I think particularly it comes down to being, the most alert person in the room and understanding what's going on with folks, and that's where you can actually save someone's life because, as you pointed out, um, you know, generalized therapy for OCD isn't just ineffective; it can actually be harmful if and so it's teachers play a very large role in helping people get to the right evidence-based treatment. To your question, though, about prevalence, 1 in 40 people suffer with OCD at some point in their life, right? So that's the lifetime prevalence. It's roughly 2.5% of the overall population, which is, it's a very prevalent, serious mental illness, relatively speaking. People with it are 10 times more likely to die by suicide when left untreated, and they're also, you know, uh, they're likely to become disabled if they don't get the right treatment early on in their journey, and that's also shown from the World Health Organization. So when it comes to children, though, the prevalence rate is, I believe, 1 in 100 kids at some point in a given time frame. I think it's about a year suffer with OCD. So at any given point, there's 1 in 100 children suffer with it, and that's, I'd say, probably a stat that might even increase as time progresses and as OCD awareness becomes um, just better across society, because you're going to start to have more people come forward who have the condition, more children come forward who may meet the diagnostic criteria for it. And that's going to allow, I think, schools to then implement the treatment interventions needed to best serve their kids who have OCD.
Yeah, and I can't help but wonder if the pandemic and the what used to be called a false positive and is now called asymptomatic spread could have contributed to some of these feelings that somebody could get someone sick by not being sick themselves, and
Mhm.
that as our family was learning about it through the pandemic, I saw a lot of these things that made me start feeling like maybe there's something that I did that could have caused someone to get hurt. And it wasn't OCD, but I saw the relationship to that and wondered if maybe that was something that has maybe increased this in kids. Do you have any data or insight on that?
So, we know that with any stressful situation, it oftentimes increases OCD symptoms. So OCD is known from this research to be caused by both genetic and environmental factors. So someone who may have OCD but may not be suffering at a given point, they may start to suffer at a given point given some environmental factors, and COVID was an environmental factor that did cause people to feel more stress, and therefore, many folks start to experience OCD symptoms in throughout the pandemic. And so with that being said, there's been a rush of access of treatment for all different types of treatments for mental health since COVID. And we know that if people with OCD don't get the right treatment, it's not just ineffective, it's actually harmful. So in certain cases, COVID may have heightened symptoms because it also pushed the industry to deliver more and more treatment that may not be evidence-based for OCD, and actually put children at risk in many ways. And so what we're trying to do is to solve that problem by spreading awareness, especially through schools, knowing the fact that if folks can understand just really what OCD is like, and it's so misunderstood in society, we'll be able then to reach children earlier on in their journey and potentially help them before the condition spirals out of control and affects them later on. Because it's a incredibly important time, right? Getting a child educated in elementary, middle school, and even high school. We want to make sure that they can utilize that time to develop in the best way possible.
Yeah. So there are certain ailments like Down syndrome, for example, where somebody is born with it and that's going to be their life, and how it impacts them is going to be different. But the fact that OCD can be caused by genetic factors and environmental factors makes it that much more challenging to know if it's happening. And the symptoms can be hidden for some time and mask as something else or look like something else, or they may do things in secret or private to not show anybody that they're doing those compulsions, but the obsessions could be there for a long time before they ever start showing something outwardly, and then it can kind of spiral out of control, as it were. And so one of the things that I think is really fascinating here is I heard either from one of your therapists or read it on the website or something that it can take several years for OCD to actually be diagnosed, that it doesn't always, like, you start feeling it and then you're like, oh, I need to go get checked out. You hide those things, you don't share them, and then it could take several years. Is that what you've seen as well?
That is exactly what we've seen. So on average, it takes 14 to 17 years for someone with
14 to
OCD.
17 years?
14 to 17 years
Oh my
for someone with
gosh.
OCD to get to evidence-based treatment. And what's challenging is, despite this, it's one of the most manageable serious mental illnesses, given that ERP is so effective. So because ERP is so effective, and I've personally experienced the effectiveness of it, I know many others have as well. If someone simply was just identified earlier on in the journey and managed with ERP, they could likely, manage this condition in a 3-month window and be back on their feet without having to really experience any traumatic life events because of it. And so that's what's ultimately going to solve this problem, is if we had better awareness for what OCD is actually like, people, would feel comfortable actually disclosing what they're going through, because they know it may not be them, it may be this condition. Teachers and other folks in the community might be more comfortable asking specific questions to see what they're experiencing with OCD, knowing that if they have symptoms, they can get referred to a licensed therapist or psychiatrist that specializes in running diagnostic assessments and can give them an actual read as to what's going on. So it's a problem that actually can be solved, despite the kind of shocking stats that come along with the population of people with OCD. So 14 17 years is the average today, unfortunately, but we think that time can be reduced to 14 to 17 hours if we simply just had the right awareness campaigns going on.
Yeah. And once you understand what it is and how to treat it, then it becomes much less daunting and much less scary, which I think is incredibly valuable. So you mentioned ERP, and let's go back to that. ERP stands for Exposure Response Prevention. Tell us what that is and why that's so effective in treating OCD.
Sure. So to your point, ERP stands for Exposure and Response Prevention, and it's a treatment that actually pokes at the reason for why OCD is so severe in the first place. So as mentioned before, OCD is a condition where people have these recurring intrusive thoughts, images, and urges. They oftentimes violate the person's core values and character. They create tremendous amounts of distress. So people, and naturally, what they want to do is they want to make those fears stop, so they can stop their distress. That's the logical reaction. Well, that logical reaction ultimately is a compulsive behavior, right? So people trying to stop the thoughts ultimately makes the thoughts worse and worse over time, or the images and urges worse and worse over time, which leads to the stress, increasing over time. So what ERP does is ERP says, instead of doing those compulsive behaviors, a therapist that especially trained in ERP is going to teach that patient to learn how to respond to their fear in a way where they don't do the compulsive behavior. They instead accept uncertainty. So it's teaching someone how to respond to their OCD fears in such a way where they no longer bother them as much over time. It literally rewires the person's brain. So an example would be, if a mother has postpartum OCD, she may fear, what if I accidentally hurt my children? And so what she may do as a response is she's so afraid of the fear, she may avoid her children. Well, an ERP therapist may say, well, instead, I actually want you to hold your child And I want you to accept the uncertainty that you may or may not hurt your child, but you'll live with that uncertainty and you'll help your child anyways. And over time, what ends up happening is the mother realizes, wow, this fear is preposterous, right? It's actually not me. It's this, and no matter if it happens or not, the mother still takes care of her children, and then eventually the stress decreases. Eventually, the mother can have some clarity in how she functions throughout the day. So that's an example of OCD. In kids, you may have a scenario where someone is afraid that if they don't brush their teeth for an hour straight, their younger brother will have a serious accident, right? So what the child will do is they'll brush his or her teeth for an hour straight, and then eventually we'll be in a scenario where that's the only action that can make the fear stop. So the certainty that child has temporarily will be removed over time, and eventually the fear will start happening more and more throughout that child's life. If the child instead says, well, I'm just going to have this fear, I'm not going to brush my teeth, I'm going to accept the uncertainty something can happen to my brother or sister, at that point, the child is learning that, it's okay to accept uncertainty, and the child's brain will act rewire, and they'll be able to then not have the same amount of stress. So ERP it just teaches the patient, again, how to respond to their OCD fear in such a way where they're not doing the compulsive behaviors. They're learning instead how to accept uncertainty. And then over time, they eventually regain their life. And that's why ERP is known as the gold standard treatment intervention for the OCD population.
Yeah. And so what it does is it takes that belief or fear that they have, and instead of giving into the fear and trying to fix it, it just says, yeah, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. And that's okay. And like, that is such a good thing for all of us to know about all of our fears that it really makes a lot of sense why that helps. Now, talk about the harm that can happen when treating with general therapy, because that's a real issue too.
Yes. So, you make a great point about the importance of accepting uncertainty. OCD is the doubting disorder. So, people oftentimes doubt just very specific characteristics of themselves or others, and it's really focused around, as a result, the acceptance of uncertainty. So what other therapist will do that's not specially trained in OCD and ERP, especially if a person isn't diagnosed, is they'll offer talk therapy, or they'll offer some type of thought stopping therapy, like generic CBT. And what happens in that situation is the person, I'll use the example of the child who fears something bad is going to happen to their sibling, right? The child may have a fear, what if my sibling gets hurt? The generic talk therapist or the CBT therapist may say, well, look, let's analyze that thought and let's understand if that's actually valid or not. Well, OCD manifests in ways that are completely illogical, right? And people who have OCD know that. They know that it doesn't make sense, and that's why they spend so much time trying to figure out why they're having the fears or trying to analyze their thought, because they can then, if they can figure out the reason, they'll stop happening, and therefore they can go on and live their life without distress. But there's no answer, right? And so in this case, a therapist will either reassure the person or the child that their sibling is totally fine, and that reassurance is a compulsive behavior, or B, they'll try to challenge the person's fears and try to get them to analyze their thoughts more, which ultimately is a compulsive behavior as well. So what usually happens is, when misdiagnosed, therapists that don't have specialty training, from what we've seen, will offer treatment and interventions that are actually compulsive behaviors. Cause the condition to worsen to the point where usually what happens, unfortunately, is the person with OCD then develops comorbidities, so they'll become depressed. They could develop an eating disorder. They could develop a substance use disorder, or B, they'll then get moved to a higher form of care, and they'll spend time away from school. There'll be an intensive treatment, potentially residential treatment, and it's really difficult then to bounce back from that. So it's critical for schools, knowing the prevalence of OCD, to have very strong OCD identification programs, because it could actually save someone's life, right? They could save them from not just years of suffering, but also it could save them from having to lose out on just incredibly important social moments, right? When you go through school, it can help save them on learning key things about themselves, right, and others. And so I've it's probably one of the most important programs can need to be added to any school mental health program.
Yeah, and most people don't really understand it, and that's why I thought it was so important to talk with you. So the other thing about that, the other kinds of therapy, is that they actually lead to more of the compulsive disorder part of this. But the other thing is that if you're going into a therapist and talking about these things, when they're calm and understand what's going on, those with OCD know that their thoughts are illogical and that their fears are wrong, and yet they still can't help but do the compulsions to combat them and that's part of the challenge. But then also if they're not in the environment where they are having the challenges, then it's even more difficult because they don't have those fears in the therapist's office, for example. And which is why I think what you're doing with treatment OCD is so powerful, because it's virtual calls that can happen in the child's home or in the person's home where some of those things may be more prevalent, and give them real experiences to be able to deal with those fears that are right there in front of them, where when they're away from them, they can know they're totally illogical, but then it's hard to go back and do that. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect?
Sure. So, OCD is a chronic condition, right? So it manifests in different times throughout the day. It manifests in ways that can morph, right? So, for example, someone can have one fear, then 6 weeks later it transitions to a different fear. And so, with that, there needs to be a treatment that is not only effective ERP, but it has to be delivered in a way that's also flexible to someone's life, right? Because you may be 1 week triggered at school. Well, that's great, but then the next week you may be triggered at a different location, given your fear is morphed, or you may have I'd say experiences with OC that are more severe between your therapy appointments versus actually in session. So there's a variety of ways that the OC manifests, and so we have to have a model that's delivered in a way that fits how OC um, is experienced by people. So what we did at NoCD is we made our treatment 100% virtual. So people do live face-to-face sessions with licensed therapists from our network who all specialize in OC and ERP. We actually train all of our therapists before they actually see any of our members, in addition to their licensure. So think about it as like a fellowship program, but it's one for therapy. We call it NoC University. In addition to that, we supervise or actively monitor our therapists every week, just to ensure that we can support them to deliver the best possible outcomes to our members. We call the people we serve members, just because it's a hybrid between a patient client. We wanted to create a term that reflected our team's value of our community. So we have a community of people across the world. And so, between sessions, though, when someone's not with their clinician, what do? Right? They are, going to school. They have to go to sports practices. They go to piano or other instruments. There's a variety of different things that people do. And so we want to make sure that we can be with them in that moment. And so we create a model where people can, between sessions, message their therapist asynchronously. Parents can also do that for their kids. In addition, people can access different peer communities as well as self-help tools to help them do treatment homework and get support when needed. And so it's a model that is we consider 24/7 to fit a 24/7 chronic condition like OCD. And we wanted to make it virtual for another reason, which is, to your point, with doing ERP in a virtual setting, you can actually go to where someone is triggered the most. So if I'm, for example, a therapist, which I'm not, but if I'm one of our therapists, I could see one of our members in an office setting. And in a net setting, I couldn't actually, or I won't be able to go into this grocery store or to the school where someone's actually experiencing their OCD symptoms in the most severe way. But with virtual therapy, the therapist can go with them, or with their members, to the exact locations, right? So if I have 5 members and I'm an OCD therapist, I could go in a several hour window to each location where each person actually experiences their condition. Whereas in a brick and mortar setting, you can't do that because there's a travel component to it. There's also it's hard to replicate some of the experiences that people have, and so by immersing into the real world in a more granular way, I think people will be able to get. But we've actually shown this clinically. There's better responses to treatment. People get better in a faster amount of time, and there's better adherence in the standard.
Yeah. And like you can put your headphones in, put your phone in your pocket and be standing in the grocery store, really struggling, and nobody in the world will know that you're in a therapy session at the moment, right? That's the amazing thing about it, is that you can get the support that you need where you need it and when you need it, but not be, like if you go to the store with a therapist and the therapist is there like coaching you up, that's going to be awkward and make it more difficult for people to do it. But if they're in your headphones, they can be coaching you through living with that uncertainty and being okay with it while you're standing in the grocery aisle. And I think that kind of access is just really powerful, especially for this kind of disorder.
Yeah, I'll give you a personal example of that. So I have OCD as mentioned. About 6 months ago, my OCD started to become more severe. I'm not sure why. It just kind of happens. It's a chronic condition, and the fear morphed to fear that was surrounded around choking. So for some
Mhm.
reason was eating food, and I like one day just was not able to chew and swallow my food. I was getting really nervous, like I can't eat. What's going on here? And so went enrolled back into OCD therapy, saw my therapist. We literally went to a Texas Roadhouse because I had a fear of chewing steak in particular
Mhm.
because it's harder to chew. And I was in my session at a Texas Roadhouse. I'm living in the San Antonio area, and was doing my session at Texas Roadhouse. My headphones were in, my camera was up. I was by myself in chewing the steak, and and that was my exposure. And I'm like in the exact environment where I actually have my fears. And that was to me like one of the reasons why I think that fear was managed in a relatively quick way. I can eat and whatever I want anymore. So you know it's been well managed. But that's an example, a personal example for how this is different. Whereas in a brick and mortar setting, it's harder to replicate, that exact scenario.
Yeah. So this has been really good information. Is there anything else that we should have talked about that we didn't yet?
We are looking for ways to work with schools, and OCD in particular, so we can help raise awareness for OCD. We have partnerships with Howie Mandel, so who's looking to raise awareness with us. He's been incredible this year in doing that. Others in the industry too are looking to raise awareness. We're hoping to ensure that every single teacher, mental health counselor at a school could recognize and understand OCD, knowing it's so misunderstood. And if we can do that, then we know we'll be able to help so many people, live a really happy and healthy life who would typically go to see a therapist that would make them worse. And we're trying to prevent that, right? And we're trying to reduce the time from 14 to 17 years to 14 to 17 seconds. And in terms of getting identified with having OCD symptoms, so I'm raising that because we'd love to find ways to collaborate with different schools. If anyone's interested in collaborating, we'd love to sync up one on one and find ways to work together, knowing it takes a village to bring meaningful change. And yeah, I mean that's just I think one of the final points I like to raise because we want to make sure we have every child taken care of early on in their journey.
Yeah, I agree. And having seen how it works and how it can help right away, it's definitely powerful. So no CD is the name of your company. Treatmyocd.com is a website you can go to. I think you can go to nocd.com also, right?
Yep, yep.
Okay.
So exactly.
Yep. Well, Stephen, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time and for being part of the Brazilian Schools podcast.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate you setting this up, Jethro.